welcome back to True Crime and Politics. My name is Erica, and I am here to walk you through some of the lives and crimes of the USA's most corrupt and disgusting politicians by telling their stories in the form of a true crime documentary. Or in other words, by treating them like the criminals they are. This is part 3 of the George H.W. Bush saga. So if you haven't yet watched parts 1 and 2, well, I recommend that you do that. And therefore, I will put those links in the description below alongside a whole mess of sources so that you're able to verify that I'm really not yanking your chain when I tell you Poppy Bush was a bad man. In the last episode, I covered how Bush, first with the CIA as director and then later with his pal Reagan, helped ensure that literal Nazis and fascists had all of the money and guns and support that they needed to build hundreds of concentration camps for the torture and murder of innocent civilians across South America for almost a decade. But it turns out that is just one vile example of how the Reagan-Bush administration would proceed with foreign policy. Today, I'm going to cover the very best known scandal of the Reagan-Bush administration, Iran-Contra. And I'm going to show you how their years-long multi-continental crime spree had terrible rippling effects across the globe as well as back home in the USA. And this scandal is actually so intrinsic to the Reagan-Bush era that we have to start before they even got elected. So let's just dive right in, shall we? In order to win the White House, Reagan and Bush had to beat the sitting president, Jimmy Carter, in the election. And winning against an incumbent president is historically a very challenging task. But Jimmy had vulnerabilities, and the biggest one was this ongoing hostage crisis that he seemed unable to resolve, and it was starting to tank his popularity. Now, Jimmy had kind of set off this whole hostage crisis situation in the first place by allowing the recently overthrown Shah of Iran to move to the US for cancer treatment. And I know on the surface that doesn't seem like enough to spark an international catastrophe. But the thing is that for Iran, this was just kind of like a last straw for them with the United States government. You see, the US CIA, under the leadership of our good old friends, the Dulles brothers, well, they had worked with British intelligence in order to coup Iran's popular elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, all the way back in 1953. And then those wily intelligence agencies, well, they had installed the Shah to run the country. And the Shah had been a brutal and repressive dictator whose main job was to help the US and Great Britain control Iran's oil. Now, Iranians knew that the Shah was just a Western puppet who had been installed to allow the looting of their natural resources. And they knew that the US had been providing aid and weapons to the Shah for decades in order to help him stay in power. And after a massive popular uprising in 1979, the Iranians had finally succeeded in removing the Shah from power. And they wanted him back in Iran for trial for corruption and human rights abuses. I mean, they wanted to bring this man to justice. Can't really blame them, right? But then Jimmy allowed the deposed dictator to basically just come and retire to the United States afterwards. And the Iranian people felt like this was Carter and the US government shielding the Shah from their righteous prosecution. And given everything that the US had done to benefit the Shah and to the detriment of the Iranian people, well, that was just like a giant pile of salt dumped into their fresh, gaping wound. And that is why in November of 1979, a bunch of pissed off Iranians stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 U.S. hostages. And this was becoming a bigger and bigger problem for Jimmy as the 1980 presidential elections were in full swing, and he still had not managed to get those people home safely. The U.S. public was getting madder by the day. And that made Jimmy vulnerable to a huge election day loss. However, there were rumors of an October surprise that Jimmy had planned in order to give his foreign policy creds a little bump before the election. The rumor was that he was going to get all of those hostages home safely in a nice pre-election or October surprise. But in a twist ending, the October surprise later became known as the Reagan Bush plot to prevent Jimmy from getting those innocent U.S. citizens home safely. You see, naturally, Jimmy's October surprise never came through, but all those hostages were released, and they were released within like moments of now President Reagan and Vice President Bush being sworn into office. A lot of people thought, that's kind of suspicious. I mean, it is kind of weird, right? Because like Iran held all of those hostages in defiance of the United States for over a year, despite the fact that Carter was like working around the clock in crisis mode, doing everything he could think of to try to get them home safely. But Reagan and Bush, apparently all they had to do was just like get sworn into office, and within moments before there was even a chance to negotiate or have a conversation or even make a frickin' phone call, it was like Iran suddenly was too scared to defy the will of the United States and just kindly handed back every single hostage. So that's why this theory began to develop, that Reagan and Bush had actually negotiated with Iranian leadership to ensure that those prisoners would not be released by the Carter administration so that they could bolster their chances of winning the election, which is pretty screwed up because that would mean that they had ensured that a bunch of U.S. citizens remained hostage for several additional months. And this wasn't just like a wild conspiracy theory. Like, this was a theory that gained so much traction, it spawned multiple investigations, including in the House and in the Senate. Now, to be fair, the theory was never undeniably proven, but those investigations brought some interesting facts to light. For instance, we know that Bush had ears on the ground in Iran due to some of his old oil connections in the area. And there's also this handwritten note from October of 1980 that demonstrates that Bush knew that Carter had a plan in the works to free those hostages, and also that his people on the ground were like asking what they should do about it. Oh no, those innocent hostages are about to be rescued. How can we stop it? That's suspicious. But what I find most convincing are the findings of Gary Sick. Now, Gary was in the Carter administration, but he also served on the National Security Council monitoring Iran for almost 5 years. So, he's a serious guy. Now, Sick conducted hundreds of interviews in the US, in Europe, and in the Middle East, trying to get to the bottom of the October surprise. And he consistently came back with the exact same story, which was that the Reagan administration had definitely done everything in their power to keep those hostages from being returned home safely by the Carter administration, and that in exchange, they had offered Iran's leadership future weapons sales through Israel for the favor. Some even said that Bush himself was present at least one of the meetings negotiating the deal. Now, maybe that is just hearsay, and that is basically what the folks on Cap Hill decided. But Gary had like a lot of people on the record telling the exact same story. And later on, we found out that shortly after Reagan and Bush took office, well, those weapons, they started flowing from the US to Iran through Israel, just like the man had said. Which leads us to the Iran-Contra Affair was by far the most publicized scandal of the Reagan-Bush era. Now, that it occurred is not in doubt. I mean, congressional investigations occurred, people were arrested and charged with multiple felonies. It happened. But depending on who you ask, you might get different answers as to who was ultimately responsible and how far up the ladder it went. Explaining this portion of history is complicated even when you try to simplify it, because even at face value, Iran-Contra is not a scandal. It's at minimum two scandals. You have an Iran scandal and you have a Contra scandal. And then once you kind of get in the weeds on those, you start realizing that those scandals are intricately connected into a rat's nest of other major scandals. So we're just going to cover the big ones and we're going to go one by one until we kind of can make sense of Iran-Contra. Let's begin with the Iran portion of the scandal while the old October surprise story is still top of mind. So here's the thing. Even though Iran had done Reagan like a major solid by holding on to all of those hostages for him until after he was elected president, well, despite that, Reagan was still publicly incredibly outspoken about his dislike and his distaste for this new government in Iran. After all, the Shah had been oh so helpful when it came to U.S. interests, and the new regime in Iran was expressly disinterested in the U.S., I mean, in the West generally, to be honest. So U.S. foreign policy towards Iran had already shifted drastically even before Reagan took office. In example, the U.S. went from the #1 arms dealer to Iran under the Shah to an embargo on weapon sales to the country. So Carter had put in place a complete ban on weapon sales to Iran. Yeah, after the whole hostage situation, Iran was quickly deemed a state supporter of terrorism by Carter, by Reagan, by the West as a whole. And while running against Carter on the campaign trail, Reagan might have actually been the first guy who popularized that term we've all heard so many times at this point. We don't negotiate with terrorists.
It is high time that the civilized countries of the world made it plain that there is no room worldwide for terrorism. There will be no negotiation with terrorists of any kind.
Using that phrase repeatedly on the campaign trail was actually tactical. You see, it made it harder for Carter to find a compromise and get the hostages back because, if he made any concessions to Iran, well, maybe he could save these lives and get these people home safely, but then he would have also negotiated with terrorists. But on the other hand, if he made no concessions to Iran, he might not ever get those hostages back, which made him look even worse. So it's actually a pretty clever strategy on the part of Reagan. But anyway, given his rhetoric on the campaign trail, Reagan obviously decided that his administration would fall in line with what Carter's had done and continue the arms embargo on Iran. I mean, obviously, if we're not negotiating with terrorists, we're certainly not selling them weapons. And Reagan's administration actually took it a step further. So his State Department launched a whole operation called Operation Staunch. Operation Staunch was a US-led global effort to put pressure on all of the US's allies to refrain from selling weapons to Iran. It was very important to Reagan that no weapons get to this terrorist state. But at the very same time of his own arms embargo on Iran and this global pressure campaign to keep anybody from providing weapons to the terrorist state of Iran, yeah, that whole time Reagan was selling weapons to Iran. You can't make this up. Furthermore, Mr. We don't negotiate with terrorists himself, Ronald Reagan, later had to admit that his own administration had in fact negotiated with terrorists by selling weapons to Iran in exchange for hostages. Oh, the hypocrisy. But to be clear, Reagan never admitted to selling Iran weapons for those October surprise hostages, but he did totally admit to selling Iran weapons for a completely different set of US hostages that were held in Lebanon later on down the line. In any case, the man was definitely exposed as deeply fraudulent. In summation, though the October surprise portion of the scandal was never, concretely proven or what have you, what was later proven without a doubt is that from the moment Reagan took office, he started funneling tons of weapons to Iran, through Israel, no less. And of course, this broke his own arms embargo. It flew in the face of Operation Staunch, and, it defied literally everything the man had ever publicly said about the state of Iran. And so, that, my friends, was a scandal. Despite being both geographically and culturally incredibly remote from each other, Iran and Nicaragua actually had quite a bit in common back in 1979. You see, like Iran, Nicaragua had had themselves a big old popular revolution in 1979, and like Iran, Nicaragua had managed to overthrow a repressive and corrupt dictator who had ruled their country for decades with the full support of the United States. And again, like Iran, it had been the US who had aided in the rise of the Somoza family dictatorship from the ashes of what had been a democracy for the sake of U.S. interests. Boy, those U.S. interests really get around, don't they? Anyway, FDR was once quoted as having said of Somoza, like OG Somoza, "He's a bastard, but he's our bastard." But finally, after 43 years of the corrupt, repressive, US-backed Somoza family rule in Nicaragua, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, aka the Sandinistas, well, they overthrew the authoritarian Somoza family. And a socialist state was born in Nicaragua. Now, we already know from part 2 just how US interests tend to respond when they see socialism on the rise somewhere. So it should come as no shock that when the FDN, or the Fuerza Democrática Nicaragüense, don't worry, better known as the Contras, when they sprang up to fight against the new socialist government in Nicaragua, of course, there were powerful factions in the US who wanted nothing more than to lend those guys a helping hand. So again, this started under President Carter, and Carter pretty much immediately sent the CIA down to start working some of their famous propaganda campaigns and also to help organize the resistance. But Carter had refused to support any sort of armed interference in the region. So it wasn't until Reagan and Bush got into office that U.S. support for the Contras leveled up. Under the new Reagan administration, a network of CIA operatives combined with foreign allies as well as local anti-Sandinista Nicaraguans, many of whom were Somoza family loyalists, they all got together to wage out-and-out war against the new government in Nicaragua. But there were some problems out the gate because, for one, the Contras already kind of appeared like they might just be a solution that was actually far worse than the original problem. Like deciding to drink bleach to kill a stomach bug. And the second problem that the Contras pretty much immediately ran into was that the U.S. public found out about U.S. covert operations going on in Nicaragua because Newsweek actually ran a whole cover story in November of 1982 highlighting the fact that the CIA was currently engaging in a new secret war to overthrow the government in Nicaragua. Oops. The piece was critical of the obvious sloppiness of the CIA, arguing that covert action can only be effective if it is to remain covert. But the authors also pointed out that basically covert action makes us look bad when everybody finds out about it because covert action is kind of non-democratic by nature, The whole point is to get another government to submit to the will of the U.S. government, not to the will of, their own population. Quote, "No instrument of democratic government can be allowed to operate totally at odds with the ideals it is supposed to espouse and protect." End quote. Now, this was especially true at this time because basically U.S. hypocrisy had just been on full display for years because CIA operations were constantly being exposed. Finally, the article suggested that the Contras were actually more brutal and more authoritarian than the current Sandinista regime. The article then referred back to the PR crisis that resulted from CIA intervention in Chile. The death of Allende and the rise of Pinochet was cited to remind the public just how terribly these CIA operations can turn out. This article actually served to really make the American public concerned about U.S. support for the Contras, and that led to Congress passing an amendment that stated that the federal government would not provide military support for the purpose of overthrowing the government of Nicaragua. This was called the Follen Amendment, and it passed just 6 weeks after that Newsweek article dropped. The problem is Reagan read that amendment as basically just saying that U.S. armed forces were not allowed to try to overthrow Nicaragua's government. But to him, that didn't mean that he could not provide money and weapons and training to the Contras so that, he could help the Contras overthrow the government in Nicaragua. So basically, Bolin 1 didn't really accomplish anything because it was chock full of loopholes and Reagan was ever so willing to go ahead and dive through all of them. But that's just an introduction. Now that we have some understanding of what happened in Nicaragua in 1979 and why, as well as how the whole Contra controversy began in the United States, now it's time to get into who the Contras actually were and what it was that they were trained to be. This is the part where Uncle Sam reunites with his old pals in Argentina. Surely you remember the fascists in Argentina from part 2, right? Remember how they hero worshipped Hitler, how they built over 500 concentration camps, and how in those concentration camps they went on to murder tens of thousands and torture hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. Yeah, well, the CIA, they thought that, the Contras could use a little help in their mission. So they decided to go ahead and call up the Argentinians. It's like they thought, you know what this campaign is really lacking? Copious amounts of torture and terror. We know just who to call. A deal was struck between Argentine military advisors and CIA Director William Casey. The U.S., of course, would provide the guns and the money. Argentina would be on the ground directing operations, and U.S. forces would be made available from time to time for specific assignments. The clear goal was to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Thus, veterans of the dirty war in Argentina were shipped up to Central America to help shape the hearts and minds of Contra combatants. The Argentinians were on the ground to oversee the day-to-day actions and work of the Contra combatants, and the Argentinians even chose Contra leadership. So, the Contras were trained and organized by Nazi-inspired fascists. Given the fact that it was Bush's buddies from Argentina that were brought in to train the Contras, it should come as no surprise to you that Contra tactics were disgusting, illegal, and immensely destructive, to say the least. I mean, the Contras basically just became like the less organized Central American arm of Operation Condor, which was ongoing and continuing to rain terror down upon most of South America at the very same time. Like their South American peers, the Contras quickly began kidnapping, torturing, mutilating, and murdering innocent civilians, and their victims included men, women, and children. In some cases, Contra cruelty actually more closely resembled atrocities linked to the Phoenix program back in Vietnam than it did the crimes of the Condor countries down south. Multiple human rights groups found the Contras guilty of several massacres, which they likened to the infamous My Lai massacre back in Vietnam. So for those who don't know, My Lai was a small village where every man, woman, and child, little babies included, were murdered by U.S. soldiers during the Vietnam War. Even villagers who greeted the soldiers with bows of respect upon them entering the village, they were murdered too. Many of their bodies were mutilated, and several women and even young girls were gang raped during the attack. And in case you're wondering if there was like any hint of a justification for this shit, just know that the only U.S. casualty suffered during this event came when some dumb soldier got too excited with all the blood and lust and he accidentally shot himself in the foot. The victims of My Lai were wholly innocent and non-combatants. So human rights groups citing dozens of similar atrocities carried out by the Contras in Nicaragua is truly stomach-turning. One reason that the Contras were so much more openly disgusting and murderous than their Condor brethren down south was that they were not the ruling power in Nicaragua. So it's not like they had the luxury of running the country and controlling the military and then just working to quietly wipe out their opposition like the Condor leaders were doing. Instead, they had to fight a full-on war with the ruling Sandinista government. And so they were working to create chaos rather than order. They did this through overt terrorism, as in these melee type events, but they also were just like burning down entire farms, as well as food storage facilities, healthcare facilities, schools, entire villages sometimes. And then they targeted groups like teachers or student volunteer workers, also agricultural specialists, healthcare workers, and even church leaders. In total, the U.S. funded and fueled Contra War ended with 50,000 casualties, 10,000 of which were civilian casualties, and 250,000 Nicaraguans were forced from their homes during the war. And the Reagan administration backed this war and prolonged this war every step of the way. And Reagan even once called the Contras, quote, the moral equals of our founding fathers. Just like in Operation Condor down in South America, propaganda became a central arm of the US government's pro-Contra efforts. So, like, you remember how the CIA built this whole propaganda machine in their attempts to take down Allende in Chile? Or even better, how the CIA convinced the fascists in Argentina to just hire a US PR firm so that they could gaslight the US public into thinking that they, the Nazi-inspired fascist terrorists leading Argentina, were actually fighting terrorism. Remember? Well, then it should not come as a shock to you that there was a huge propaganda push in the United States in order to steer public opinion towards pro-Contra policies. Reagan and Bush actually created the first ever United States official peacetime propaganda ministry, and they called it the Office of Public Diplomacy. This dystopian ministry created fake news stories and had them printed in even our most prestigious papers, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and even our beloved paper of record, the New York Times. And of course, made-up cable news segments flowed directly from this Orwellian Office of Public Diplomacy as well. And they didn't stop there. They actually bullied journalists who had the integrity to report on the viciousness of the Contras. For example, Otto Reich, the guy who was responsible for running this real-life Ministry of Truth, well, he went to NPR and just like broadly threatened them to get them to fall in line. And it worked, because after that, apparently, editors at NPR started going to their journalists and asking them to consider, what would Otto Reich think as they wrote their articles? Reich also literally bragged about having journalists either fired or moved to other stories if he didn't like the way that they were reporting on the Contras. And this man even went so far as to have salacious stories printed about journalists who refused to fall in line or who he thought were just too sympathetic to the Sandinistas. One journalist who was accused of reporting too leniently about the Sandinistas ended up finding himself defamed by the press watchdog group called Accuracy in Media. Yeah, right. Anyway, they referred to him as Johnny Sandinista, and they made the claim that the Nicaraguan government was providing him, as well as other journalists, with quote-unquote trustworthy Sandinista women. These women were supposedly live-in sex slaves in exchange for favorable journalism, but Reich's main target, this decorated journalist named John Lantigua, was living with his fiancée at that time, and the other reporter Reich was gunning for was actually gay. But that didn't deter Otto Reich. Of course it didn't. He marched straight over to New York Magazine and he let them know that he had heard from former Sandinistas that it isn't only women, and this thing is sordid. Naturally, all of this was perfectly illegal. I mean, we know that the CIA had been doing this sort of in other countries going back decades at this point, but technically the US government was not allowed to build up this sort of psychological warfare campaign against its own population. You know, because we have the First Amendment, and that is supposed to mean that the government is not permitted to go out and start bullying journalists and planting a bunch of fake news stories all over the place just to spin their narrative. Not in the USA. But they f***ing did it, and all just to convince us to support a bunch of child murdering terrorists. Naturally, this giant PR campaign, it wasn't only aimed at promoting the Contras, it was also aimed at maligning the Sandinistas. So basically everywhere in the media, the Sandinistas were portrayed as authoritarian, repressive, ruthless, and even sadistic. They were a special sort of evil that must be stopped. And of course, the Reagan administration pushed the Cold War agenda here as well. So they insisted that the Sandinistas were just another arm of the evil Soviet communist bloc, and that they were going to wreak havoc on Central America. Reagan insisted that the Sandinistas were bound to invade neighboring democracies so that they could spread their evil doctrine and their authoritarian institutions across the lands. I have to say, I'm in no way convinced that the Sandinistas were bad or evil, or especially that they were belligerent towards their neighbors or had any intention of being aggressive towards their neighbors, because the reality was that they had their hands completely full fighting the Contras, and they also were pretty sure like the US was going to invade any day, so they were trying to prepare for that. Like, they didn't have the time or the resources to be preparing an invasion at the same time, even if they wanted to, which I don't think there's any evidence that they did. And when you look at what the Sandinistas actually set out to do within their country, the wild lengths that the Reagan administration went to stop them make even less sense. I mean, the Sandinistas worked diligently in an attempt to end all poverty in Nicaragua. And they also led one of the most successful literacy campaigns that the world has ever seen. The Sandinistas also provided universal health care to the entire population, and their health care was so efficient that the population of Nicaragua grew by 28% in only 6 years, simply due to the fact that so many fewer people were dying, and infant mortality specifically plummeted under the Sandinista regime. So, why, oh why, was the Reagan-Bush administration so dead set on stopping the Sandinistas, on stopping the people who were basically just minding their own business and trying to, end poverty and save babies and educate their people? Like, were the Sandinistas actually bad or authoritarian or repressive in any way? Or do a bunch of people still just think that because the Reagan and Bush administration was so successful at propagandizing the world and especially US citizens to think that? What do you think? Let me know down below. In spite of the vast efforts of the Reagan administration to convince the US populace to hold an unreserved hatred of the Sandinistas in their hearts and a boundless support for the Contras, a lot of Americans were not buying it. And there was still a strong movement within the United States that wanted the government to back all the way off from the Contra War. And because Reagan and Bush had so blatantly disregarded the intent of the original Boland Amendment, Congress intervened again in 1984 with a second Boland Amendment. And in this second Boland Amendment, they really strengthened the language and did everything in their power to eliminate any possible loophole. Boland 2 read, during fiscal year 1985, no funds available to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, or any other agency or entity of the United States involved in intelligence activities may be obligated or expended for the purpose or which would have the effect of supporting directly or indirectly military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua by any nation, group, organization, movement, or individual. Loophole free, boy howdy. I mean, the language really couldn't have been clearer this time around. Don't interfere in Nicaragua for any reason, under any circumstances. From this point on, any support of the Contras was unquestionably illegal. But, of course, the Reagan administration didn't really view this new law as a reason to stop supporting the Contras. Instead, it was almost like they viewed it as, an opportunity to get more creative with it and find new and better and different ways to support and fund the Contras without the knowledge of Congress. And that, my friends, was another scandal. They found their funding through several nefarious actions, including taking donations from foreign governments like Saudi Arabia and Taiwan. And also there's a banking scandal tied into this whole mess, as well as just boatloads of crack cocaine. So this party's just getting started, guys. But of course, the other mechanism for maintaining a continuous flow of money to the Contras in Nicaragua was the unending selling of weapons to Iran. So the vast majority of the profits from the 100% illegal super secretive weapon sales to Iran was funneled directly to support the 100% illegal Contra war in Nicaragua. And that's why the whole mess became known as the Iran-Contra Affair. On November 3rd, 1986, a Lebanese magazine broke the first of what would become so many stories about the Iran-Contra Affair. What they reported is that the White House was currently selling weapons to Iran in order to secure the release of US hostages that were being held right there in Lebanon. From there, it didn't take authorities long to figure out that the majority of the money from those secret arms sales to Iran had seemed to evaporate, just disappeared. And after that, it didn't take much investigating for them to figure out that millions of dollars from those sales had been diverted to help the Contras in Nicaragua. It was immediately clear to literally everybody in the world that Reagan was a lying hypocrite, but also that a whole lot of laws had been broken here. I mean, for one, we know already that we have Reagan's own arms embargo on Iran, which made his administration selling them weapons under any circumstances completely and entirely illegal. And this was obviously in violation of the Second Boland Amendment, which could not have been more clear. Do not support the Contras in any way, shape, or form. But also, legal experts quickly began pointing to potential violations of the National Security Act, the Arms Export Control Act, and this little document known as the United States Constitution, because the Constitution requires that Congress is the one responsible for appropriating all funds for government operations. Woo, buddy. Now, of course, Reagan, he was shocked, just shocked to find out what had been going on in his very own administration. So he called for an investigation immediately to find out just what had happened and who was responsible. Reagan asked former Senator John Tower, former Secretary of State Edmund Muskie, and former National Security Advisor Brent Snowcroft to get together and try to get to the bottom of it. And thus, the Tower Commission was born. The Tower Commission did go on to interview a lot of people, but here's the thing. They were not granted the power to subpoena documents, compel testimony, or grant immunity from prosecution, so it was an entirely toothless investigation. The Tower Commission literally had zero of the tools necessary to conduct a real investigation. All they could do was go around asking questions and hope that people told them the truth or even responded to them. I mean, this makes it no surprise that the Tower Commission didn't really come up with much. And in the end, they decided that all that happened was that there were a couple of bad apples in Reagan's administration. It was those guys, John Poindexter and Oliver North from the National Security Council, and then to a lesser degree, Secretary of State Caspar Weinberger. Those were the ones that were guilty of everything. And Reagan, well, the only thing that Reagan was guilty of was just a little bit of negligence in the oversight of his staff. Go figure. If you let the man being investigated handpick all of the members that are about to investigate him, and then you dramatically limit the resources of that investigative body to boot, they don't really come up with much. The Tower Commission was a joke, is what I'm saying. I mean, look at this picture. They really look like they're grilling H.W. right there. For obvious reasons, the American public was not particularly satisfied by the Tower Commission investigation. So the House decided to hold their own investigation on Iran-Contra, and this took place over the course of 41 days. Through this process, they were able to find many more bad apples, and 14 people ended up being charged with various felonies for their participation in this crime spree. But like the Tower Commission, the House also failed to implicate either Reagan or Bush because, like the Tower Commission, they didn't try to. Quote, Sabotaged by political cowardice, committee members decided early on not to pursue evidence of White House criminality all the way to the Oval Office because they argued the country didn't need another Watergate. End quote. Instead, Oliver North and John Poindexter, both of whom were appointed to the National Security Council by Reagan, well, they again took the brunt of the responsibility for these crimes. And following that, a dog and pony show ensued that would ensure the majority of US citizens would find this to be a scandal worth forgetting about, or all out endorsing. Oliver North testified that he had just basically lied to every agency with an acronym, and also testified that he had shredded most of the evidence himself. Meanwhile, John Poindexter, well, he was forced to admit that Reagan had signed off on just one order to ship weapons to Iran, but he insisted overall the buck stopped with him on the operations front, and Reagan had been completely in the dark. What's really wacky is that Oliver North and John Poindexter, who admitted in public on national television to committing a whole slew of felonies over the course of this years-long multi-continental crime spree, they were somehow made into national heroes by their congressional testimony. Quote, "The congressional investigation cast an Orwellian pall over the scandal, turning villains into heroes and criminality into patriotism. Rather than a major inquiry into the crimes of the state, the congressional hearings became a televised advertisement for the zealotry of the scandal's perpetrators. Oliver North began his testimony as an obscure NSC staffer, and he finished as a certified political celebrity." Yup. The congressional hearings were just a silly circus, and they only served to divert attention away from the seriousness of the crimes that were committed, and instead to the passions of the perpetrators and their belief in their just and noble cause. By the end, many who believed both Reagan and Bush were culpable in this scandal actually approved of their actions. And by the way, most people recognized that they were probably guilty. 2/3, 66% of Americans polled believed that Poindexter was covering for somebody higher up in the administration, and the majority of those people believed it was for the president himself. But Congress, well, they just admonished Reagan for being a little dishonest and, negligent. They only used words like slightly harsher than those of the Tower Commission, and that was that. Because of the deeply limited findings of both the House investigation and the Tower Commission, supporters of Reagan and Bush will forevermore claim, hey, they were found innocent. This case is closed, no harm, no foul, ain't nothing to see here. But further investigations painted a very different picture. Alongside the Tower Commission and the House hearings, there was also an independent counsel assigned to investigate Iran-Contra in December of 1986. And unlike the Tower Commission, which investigated only for 3 months, or the congressional hearings, which lasted a mere 41 days, this independent counsel, Lawrence Walsh, he spent 7 years and $39 million investigating the Iran-Contra scandal. And Lawrence Walsh did find that this conspiracy went all the way to the top. And he also found that the cover-up Well, it went way further than all of the documents Oliver North had already admitted to shredding. For example, Vice President Bush withheld evidence. He withheld all of his personal diaries for the length of the investigation. Furthermore, Walsh discovered that old Johnny Poindexter was a big fat liar because he told Congress that Reagan had only signed off on just that one weapons sale to Iran. But Walsh found Reagan had signed off on every single one of them. And also that Reagan had approved the continuation of the Contra War after the Second Boland Amendment of 1984 passed. Meanwhile, Vice President Bush, who had claimed over and over and over and over and over that he was completely out of the loop on this whole Iran-Contra affair, well, he was absolutely positively lying through his damn teeth because, according to Walsh, Bush was at nearly every key meeting about the arms sales to Iran. And Bush even chaired a secret special situation group that recommended some specific different types of covert action in Nicaragua. And one of the recommendations that came directly from that group that he chaired was the implementation of underwater mining operations. So they're like planting mines in Nicaraguan harbors. Now, those operations ended up being so devastating and destructive for Nicaragua that the International Court of Justice actually found the United States guilty and responsible for all the damages. And by the way, that same case, which was Nicaragua versus the United States, by the way, yeah, in that case, the United States was actually found guilty generally for all of the damage caused by the Contra War in Nicaragua, and the US was ordered to pay them reparations. But Reagan was still president at that time, so he basically just told the UN to off, and he vetoed the UN Security Council resolution ordering him to pay up. Anyway, so Walsh's investigation continued on into the Bush presidency, and Walsh legitimately considered indicting both Reagan and Bush because he thought he had the evidence to do it. But then Walsh went and visited Reagan informally, and he found out Reagan was just too dang old. Like, Reagan was fully senile at this point, and so Walsh knew, well, there's no point in officially questioning this man. He can't remember anything. And then there's Bush. Walsh definitely wanted to indict Bush for withholding evidence. The problem was that Walsh's investigation took a while to get to Bush, and by the time he got there, Bush was the president. And so Walsh was like, shoot, I better really have my ducks in a row before I go after the sitting president. And he considered, maybe I should wait until he's out of office. Well, that last tactic totally backfired on Walsh because, of course, Bush wanted himself out of the hot seat. He wanted to put this issue to rest once and for all. So he used the presidential pardon to his advantage. And after losing the election to Clinton in 1992, he just went ahead and pardoned 6 leading figures in the Iran-Contra scandal. One of those 6 criminals, former Secretary of State Caspar Weinberger, remember him? Yeah, he had a trial coming up at which Bush was expected to testify. So those pardons actually finally and completely kneecapped the Walsh investigation. And this led Walsh to declare the Iran-Contra cover-up is finally completed. And he also referred to Bush as a president with contempt for honesty and arrogant disregard for the rule of law. Now, Walsh did persist with his investigation a little bit longer, and he did request a deposition from Bush after, Clinton relieved him of the White House. But Bush, he pulled a Nancy Reagan, and he just said no. Clearly, by that point, the investigation by Walsh had really dried up. And, Walsh wanted to go after Bush, but his counsel kind of just talked him out of it, because at this point, that would mean he was going to have to sic a legal team on what is now a former president just to try to force a deposition. So even Walsh never indicted either Reagan or Bush, and neither of them were ever found guilty of anything. Okay, fine. But I need to say this much. Lawrence Walsh was chosen because he was a legal expert, but also because of his fealty to the Republican Party. So there was no political pettiness at play here. After 7 years and millions of dollars spent studying the shenanigans of the Reagan-Bush White House, he came away fully convinced that Reagan and Bush were guilty. And of course, unlike the much publicized Tower Commission findings or that blockbuster hit known as the Iran-Contra congressional hearings, the conclusions of Lawrence Walsh flew mostly under the radar. Nothing to see here, folks. And we are still not even close to done with Iran-Contra, which is actually a good thing, because so far this episode has been pretty Reagan-centric, and now I get to show you that that is merely a consequence of old Poppy Bush exercising his one and only superpower, being utterly forgettable. Reagan was the president, and he also had his start in Hollywood, so of course he loved the spotlight. Meanwhile, Bush, well, he was only vice president, and lurking in the shadows and downplaying his role in things, well, that came natural to him given his history. So it makes complete sense that Reagan is at the center of most of the investigations and most of the articles covering Iran-Contra. And of course, Reagan was guilty as hell, but Iran-Contra, that was Bush's baby. Bush was the one with decades of experience working with the CIA. Bush was the one who knew how to set up shell companies and launder money. Bush was the one who had served as the director of Central Intelligence. Bush was the one who helped open the floodgates to Operation Condor. And because of that, Bush was the one with deep ties to the fascist Argentinian military. The guys who came to help train the Contras. Bush was the only dude in that White House who was remotely qualified to oversee a massive operation like Iran-Contra. But of course, most people don't know that history. And there's another key fact that most people are entirely unaware of regarding this case, and that is that none of the official investigations, not even the Lawrence Walsh investigation, looked into the Reagan administration prior to when the second Boland Amendment passed in 1984. But an independent investigation conducted by Rolling Stone actually found that Bush was able to help orchestrate the entire Iran-Contra affair from his office in the White House starting in 1982. The operation was initially called Black Eagle, and it began as soon as the first Boland Amendment was approved, like before it was even signed into law. The Rolling Stone investigation was based off both congressional and court documents, but also on interviews with several military officers and intelligence agents who were key operatives in Black Eagle. According to the investigation, it was actually CIA Director William Casey who first came up with a plan to basically ignore the will of Congress, but without breaking the letter of the law. So Casey proposed the first iteration of Iran-Contra to his fellow CIA devotee, George H.W. Bush, and of course, Bush was just thrilled to oblige. And that is how a shadow government was born. Though Casey was directly involved, the operation was officially outside the purview of the CIA or any other government agency. Instead, quote, he enlisted a few trusted men, most notably Bush, and added retired U.S. military officers, foreign intelligence agents, international arms dealers, and freelance operatives. All of them reported to Casey through a team of managers hidden strategically in the Vice President's office, at the National Security Council, and at the State and Defense Departments. That team started a slush fund for the Contras off of the illegal weapon sales to Iran. So when Congress finally came around and tightened up the language of the Boland Amendment in 1984, Black Eagle, or Iran-Contra, had already been off the ground for 2 years. So all of the systems and structures necessary were already in place. Like, they could maintain their dirty war in Nicaragua regardless of any laws passed by Congress at that point. And also, for the record, the passing of the Second Boland Amendment only served to intensify Bush's work in the Contra War. Right after the passage of the Second Boland Amendment, H.W. took a personal trip to Honduras in order to reassure its president, Roberto Sauso, that regardless of what Congress said or what laws they passed, the Contra War would continue, and so would the funding necessary to maintain the troops. You see, Sauso was hosting the main body of Contra forces over the border in Honduras. And so when he read about Boland II, it really put the scare into him, and Poppy had to go down there and reassure him so that he would allow the forces to remain in his country. But for the most part, Bush was able to monitor operations just out of his office in the White House. And this was partially because Reagan provided Bush access to all of his top secret briefings, meetings, and memos that were provided by the CIA. And Bush also received briefings from the National Security Council, the National Security Planning Group, and he was also chair of the National Narcotics Border Interdiction System. And all of those organizations had a shared interest in Central America. All of those organizations were in the business of collecting intel on Central America. So Bush had both of his eyes fixated on Nicaragua the whole time he was vice president. And any claims that he made that he was completely out of the loop were absurd on their face. Furthermore, one Black Eagle operative, whose codename was Lou Archer, verified that H.W.'s chief of staff, this guy named Donald Gregg, he retired from the CIA after 30 years of service explicitly so that he could go over to the White House and help H.W. run Black Eagle operations. And the choice of Donald Gregg is actually super interesting in and of itself because, well, do you guys remember all the way back in part 1 where I talked about how HW took this super suspicious trip to Vietnam that just so happened to coincide with the creation of the Phoenix program?
The Phoenix program was a CIA operation in Vietnam designed to help the US win the war there by any means necessary. The Phoenix program built concentration camps and trained a secret Vietnamese police who operated as death squads. These butchers kidnapped tens of thousands of Vietnamese civilians and subjected them to starvation, execution, and other forms of torture in a campaign of terror that was waged not just against the Viet Cong, but against anybody who refused to take a side in the Vietnamese Civil War. As many as 50,000 Vietnamese were killed as a result of this terror operation, and Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Herbert, a highly decorated U.S. soldier, went on to file several complaints about U.S. war crimes that many later attributed to the Phoenix program. Herbert stated in his book Soldier, quote, "They wanted me to take charge of execution teams that would wipe out entire families." Now, Congressman George H.W. Bush actually visited Vietnam with his old business partner, former CIA agent Thomas Devine, in December of 1967. And the pair were in Vietnam during the very weeks that the Phoenix program was being planned and established. And the Department of Defense granted them top secret clearance for their trip.
Okay, so that's relevant again now because Donald Gregg was actually a key figure in the Phoenix program. And Donald brought his friend Felix Rodriguez into Iran-Contra to act as trusted boots on the ground in Nicaragua. Stay with me here. So Felix was also a Phoenix program veteran, and that's actually where him and Donald Gregg had met. They became friends back when Donald Gregg was running this unit in Vietnam for the Phoenix program that was notorious for failing/refusing to differentiate between enemy combatants and the unarmed civilians who may or may not support them. Well, that might explain why so many Contra operations so closely resembled Phoenix program atrocities. So, newsflash, George H.W. Bush wasn't just a big fan of torture and terror, as evidenced by his long-standing friendships with the death camp dictators of Condor. Death squads and torture camps were that man's method of choice. When George H.W. Bush was given the opportunity to help organize his very own covert campaign in Nicaragua, he chose war criminals from the Phoenix program to help advise and coordinate the enterprise, and he selected brutal Argentine fascists for on-the-ground assistance, and he funneled them tons and tons of money and weapons for his very own campaign of torture, murder, and terror. The Rolling Stone investigation also spent time looking into the connections between George H.W. Bush and Manuel Noriega. Noriega was the president of Panama during this time. Now you might be wondering, what does Panama have to do with all of this? Well, it's simple. The planes full of weapons were landing in Panama before being rerouted to the Contra forces. And hang on to your butts because it will continue to get messier and more international from here. Anyway, so Noriega and Bush first got to know each other back in 1976 because, as you'll recall, in 1976, Bush was the head of Central Intelligence for the USA, and at the very same time, Noriega was the director of intelligence for the Panamanian National Guard. Noriega had actually been a paid CIA informant under Bush. So these guys didn't just know of each other, they knew each other and they had a past working relationship. And Noriega and Bush reunited in 1983 in Central America right as Black Eagle operations were getting off the ground. Also present at that meeting in 1983 were Bush's Chief of Staff, Donald Gregg, and the now infamous Oliver North. So the fact that Bush was meeting with North and Gregg and Noriega in Central America right at the same time that Iran-Contra was really getting into full swing is pretty telling. But especially once you understand like a little bit more about Noriega. Noriega was known to be one hell of an opportunist, and he was known for like ingratiating himself with powerful people just to get dirt on them so that he could help build up his own sphere of influence. And unsurprisingly, Noriega was also known for being incredibly greedy and deeply corrupt. So Noriega, well, he saw all of those planes empty after the weapons drop, and he smelled an opportunity to maybe get a little extra compensation for his role in the Iran-Contra scandal. Noriega used those planes to smuggle drugs into the United States, specifically lots and lots of cocaine, which fueled the 1980s epidemic of crack cocaine and also helped prop up Pablo Escobar's Medellin drug cartel. Yeah, the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s. This epidemic, which led to skyrocketing rates of violence and prostitution in the inner cities, as well as like a dramatic increase in child neglect and child abuse in the United States. That epidemic that ruined families and created shockwaves of instability across the United States, it probably never would have happened if it weren't for the Iran-Contra scandal. Several Black Eagle operatives told Rolling Stone that George H.W. Bush and his Chief of Staff, Donald Gregg, they knew all about Noriega's drug running, but they decided to look the other way, because keeping the bloodthirsty, child-murdering rapists known as the Contras stocked with weapons was clearly more important to them than a drug epidemic occurring right at home in the USA. A Senate subcommittee investigation regarding this drug smuggling was released in December of 1988, and it verified that Oliver North and other senior officials definitely knew about the Contra drug smuggling and decided to turn a blind eye to it. That same Senate investigation also found that there were some instances where Contra drug smugglers were actually given humanitarian aid by the very agencies that were investigating their crimes. I'm sorry, but what? Like, where's the humanitarian aid for the countless families right at home in the United States who were being affected by the epidemic that those assholes were causing? Anyway, that investigation, which became known as the Kerry Report, it did stop short of saying that like US officials were guilty of running the drugs themselves. But the Rolling Stone investigation quoted a Black Eagle operative as saying, "This business with the dope was policy, and George Bush was running the covert policy decisions." The Rolling Stone article goes on to reveal that one of the reasons that the Contra drug smuggling was allowed to happen was that some of the proceeds from those drugs were also diverted back to funding the Contras. All of this drug drama resurfaced again in 1996 when a journalist by the name of Gary Webb launched his own investigation and released a series of articles all about how the CIA had protected and aided the drug smugglers who had caused the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s. just like Rolling Stone, Webb had also found that one of the major reasons that the crack epidemic was allowed to happen was because a lot of those funds were being diverted back to help the Contras in Nicaragua. Webb's series was called Dark Alliance, the story behind the crack explosion. And that story was so widely dispersed after publication that it might actually be the very first viral story of the internet age. But unfortunately, Gary's time in the spotlight was cut short because basically every single major news outlet in the United States created a united front and came together to say that Gary Webb was nothing but a conspiracy theorist. But of course, we already know how much the CIA likes pushing propaganda. And we also know that a pro-Contra propaganda campaign was released upon the United States public by the Reagan administration, and that during that time they had infiltrated almost every major media outlet in the country. So I suspect that the CIA and mainstream media may have worked together to discredit Webb and his piece. Webb went from being an overnight sensation to being called a conspiracy theorist and being discredited and blackballed by almost every major news outlet in the country. And all of it happened in just a matter of weeks. Regardless, Webb's viral story did create renewed backlash against the CIA in the United States, and that led to further federal investigations. Now, those investigations also found that CIA agents were not involved in the drug smuggling themselves, but it also found that CIA assets certainly were, and that the CIA was entirely aware of it. Finally, those federal investigations also showed that the CIA had worked to prevent the DEA as well as other agencies from investigating their Contra assets drug smuggling activities. So the CIA didn't do it. They just knew it was happening, made sure it continued to happen, and also did their best to make sure that nobody responsible for it got into any trouble. Meanwhile, the Reagan administration went like full throttle in on the war on drugs. Now, to be fair, people were freaking out because the streets were flooded with coke and crack, and violence was on the rise throughout the country, so there was a public outcry for something to be done. However, one might think that perhaps since Reagan and Bush definitely knew that their Contra operations were the source of the problem, that perhaps they would just stop allowing the drugs to be trafficked in, for the sake of peace at home. I mean, even if you truly believe that the Sandinistas posed an actual threat to US security somehow, it still seems pretty obvious to me that the United States being flooded with drugs and violence was a much larger threat to the US population than the existence of a small socialist state in Central America. But silly me, because that would presuppose that Reagan and Bush actually gave a about regular old US citizens, and I submit that they did not. Because instead of stopping the flow of drugs into the country, instead they waged war on all of the people most affected by the influx of drugs that they were allowing. Their answer was to build more prisons and put more US citizens in cages rather than, risking an end to their secret illegal war in Nicaragua. So they created mandatory minimum sentences, which extended the sentence for any drug-related offense. These laws drove the number of non-violent drug-related offenders sitting in jail from 50,000 people in 1980 all the way up to 400,000 people by 1997. And what's worse is they went out of their way to make sure that these laws mostly affected racial minorities. Because even though crack and cocaine are literally the same exact drug, they're just cut differently. That's the only difference. But despite that, the mandatory minimum sentences for those two drugs were vastly, vastly different. And you see, this is because cocaine was incredibly popular with wealthy white Americans. We're talking like Wall Street hotshots and rich kids like, I don't know, George W. Bush. Meanwhile, crack was mostly used by poorer communities, and 80% of its users were Black. So mandatory minimums included this 100-to-1 rule that stated that a person caught with 100 times the amount of cocaine than some other person had of crack, they would get the same mandatory minimum sentence. This law perpetuated the racial disparities that persist in US prisons to this very day. And it was also the Black community which suffered the most from the crack epidemic, from the crack itself to the violence to the dissolution of thousands and thousands of families. So then to have the war on drugs laser focused and clearly targeting the exact same ethnic minority, well, that led a lot of people to think, maybe, just maybe, the entirety of the crack epidemic was engineered to destroy Black communities throughout the country. And given what we already know about George H.W. Bush, in example, helping to fuel the reemergence of literal Nazis and Nazi practices throughout South America just a few years before this, well, I think it's reasonable to ask if that was intentional. Did Reagan and Bush see this as an opportunity to push Black communities a couple more rungs down that social ladder and to imprison as many Black people as possible as like a bonus to, the drug money that this helped to fill the Contra coffers with? Let me know what you think below. I would feel negligent if I did not include one final note on the Contra drug scandal. So remember our old friend Gary Webb, the guy whose viral reporting really raised public awareness about the gross hypocrisy of Reagan's war on drugs? Well, Gary did not survive to tell more tales. Instead, Gary went on to commit suicide by shooting himself in the head 2 times. Now, because this precise manner of death is exceedingly rare, there are a lot of people who think that his death was actually the result of a CIA hit. I just want to say, from what I've read and come to understand, it does seem totally possible, maybe even probable, that Gary did in fact commit suicide. The campaign to discredit Gary Webb made him such a pariah in the news industry that he actually struggled to find work for the following 10 years. And I mean, that's despite the fact that the ensuing federal investigations basically showed that his work was correct. A rational person might think that the media would be clamoring to hire the guy who had broken a story like that. But no one would. And as a result, his marriage fell apart. He couldn't pay his bills. His life kind of just fell apart. All of which makes me think that the CIA and the State Department have way more control over the media than any of us want to believe. It's my opinion that even if the CIA did not load and cock and fire that gun into Gary's head, that they were responsible for his death. They alongside, the compliant media that blackballed him. But as usual, sources will be down in the description. Read up on this one. Let me know what you think, because I don't know. We're still not done with the fallout of Iran-Contra within the borders of the United States. So, you know how Bush ran his own privatized CIA so that he could do everything without the knowledge or funding of Congress? As we have discussed, funding the Contras came from a lot of different crazy places, and that includes the drug money, the illegal weapon sales to Iran, random donations from foreign governments, but as always, there's more. Bush's privatized CIA helped cause a financial crisis. Now, we've all lived through a financial crisis or two at this point in our lives, so we know that is expensive. The savings and loan crisis was no exception. It cost the United States hundreds of billions of dollars, and as usual, regular old working class Americans footed the bill. To help me explain, I need to introduce another book. It's called The Mafia, the CIA, and George Bush, and it's by investigative journalist Pete Bruton. Here's the story in the broadest possible strokes. So under the Reagan Bush administration, a ton of deregulation went down, which means that the federal government relaxed their rules about all sorts of stuff. Now, according to Bruton, Poppy Bush was actually at the head, the guy in charge, making the decisions on a lot of these deregulation efforts. But, as usual, Reagan gets all the credit for this stuff. Anyway, one of the things that Poppy worked to deregulate were savings and loans institutions, aka S&Ls. Historically, S&Ls had been used for individual home mortgage lending. So they were really boring and really stable. But then in 1982, the Garn-St. Germain bill passed, and that allowed S&Ls to start engaging in high-risk investments, including commercial real estate and even junk bonds. Bruton referred to this as, quote, an open invitation to criminal elements, end quote. And that's why he had a focus on the mafia. When he first started writing the book, he only meant to talk about how the mafia were connected to the S&L crisis. But as Bruton followed the money on hundreds of S&L failures throughout the country, he ended up discovering that it was actually George H.W. Bush who was ultimately responsible for the crisis. H.W. had smelled an opportunity in that massive deregulation wave, and he worked the system. He had realized that deregulated S&Ls, well, that could help him to criminally fund his privatized CIA. And hey, maybe help enrich some of his friends along the way as well, huh? A whole lot of that stolen money went, you guessed it, into Iran-Contra. Well, mostly the Contras. But a lot of it also went to funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which, is where Osama bin Laden got his start as the eventual leader of Al-Qaeda. But that's another story for another time. Anyway, so the basic story is that after this massive deregulation of the S&Ls, a whole lot of Bush's friends, and as well as separately a whole lot of mafia guys, what they would do is they would set up a fake business, send in a front man to take out a massive loan, and then they would just steal the money and file bankruptcy and call it a day. They did this again and again and again and again and again and again so many times that 1/3 of the savings and loans institutions in the United States went under. Because all of that money was federally insured, the US taxpayer had to foot the bill. So that bill was officially $124 billion, which isn't good, but Bruton went ahead and did some extra math for us, and he accounted for all of these individual bailouts that were not accounted for in that original sum, and also for interest and carrying costs. And according to Bruton, it actually cost us $500 billion, which this was a long time ago. So in today's currency, that is well over $1 trillion. And because so many of these loans that were given out to these ultimately fake businesses, well, they were for commercial real estate and real estate development, all of this ended up causing a housing bubble. And of course, that bubble burst. And then that affected any banks, insurance companies, or any financial institutions that traded in real estate, with some seriously spooky similarities to what happened in 2008 under H.W.'s own son, W. Well, the real estate crisis compounded with the S&L hit to the financial sector, and all of it together caused a recession. Of course, there were official investigations into the S&L scandal, but the problem was they didn't follow the money. And so Bush's crimes were never revealed to the greater public. Instead, a bunch of frontmen who were almost assuredly not in on the larger con, well, they had the book thrown right at them, and the big players in this game faced absolutely no consequences. In fact, they made billions of dollars. Now, of course, you're wondering, why the hell would the official investigations not bother following the money? Well, according to Bruton, the same billionaires who made crazy money off of these scams, well, they threw quite a bit of that money at politicians on both sides of the aisle. Bruton explained that Congress alone had the power to make public all of the financial documents tied to all of these S&L failures, and they refused to do so. So he thinks that it's probably because a lot of those politicians also benefited from that stolen money, and they didn't want to open themselves up to that kind of scrutiny. Because Congress absolutely refused to disclose those financial documents, Bruton had to follow the money through court documents from things like divorces, where financial disclosures are required. And while Bruton found his story by following the money, he is not the only investigative journalist out there who came to the conclusion that the SNL scandal was just another horrific Bush baby. Bush's role in this financial scandal was also highlighted by Joseph J. Trento in his book Prelude to Terror. Do you remember Trento? I referenced him a lot in part 1 of this series. To remind you, he was a very well-respected investigative journalist who spent decades and decades of his life covering the intelligence community. And he ended up writing a couple of eye-popping books about the corruption and some of the devastating failures of US intelligence. So Trento basically came up with the exact same story, except for that he got it from a bunch of former intelligence agents who were involved in the scandal, either directly or indirectly, whatever it was, they had knowledge of it. And so they basically corroborated Bruton's story completely independently of Bruton's investigation. So there you have it. Bush's rogue, privatized CIA was at the heart of a scandal that caused a major financial crisis and an eventual recession. It was a giant conspiracy, and it ended with a huge transfer of wealth from America's working poor to its elite. And all the while helped fund a renegade CIA that was causing death and destruction on a global scale. Awesome. You're probably wondering, yet again, how the fuck did Bush get away with all of this? The answer to me seems the same as it ever was. The rich and powerful are really, really good staying rich and powerful. Even though Bruton was able to build a very compelling case that put George H.W. Bush at the center of a major financial crisis, his work was continually suppressed. The Houston Post legal team continued to stop his work from going to print, despite the fact that the Post's editorial board had already vetted and approved these stories. Turned out, the Houston Post's lawyers actually worked for the man who just happened to be the second biggest villain in Bruton's story, right underneath Vice President Bush. So Bruton thinks, I think with reason, that this conflict of interest is what drove the Houston Post to continually censor his work. And finally, he ended up having to quit his job just to write a book and try to get the story out. And at first, this looked really promising because the publishing giant, Simon & Schuster, they wanted to print his book. And not only that, they wanted to make sure that they got it published ahead of the 1988 presidential election. Awesome! But you'll never guess what happened at the very last minute. Yeah, Simon & Schuster decided that actually, we'd rather wait to publish this until after the election, which of course means taking away the historic significance of breaking this great and important story ahead of an election where the person that is the corrupt creature at the center of the story is running for president. I'm sure it was just a coincidence, but it turned out that one of Bush's very good friends and former business partners was on the board of the parent company of Simon & Schuster. But like I said, I'm sure that had nothing to do with it. Because the true story of the SNL crisis was just repeatedly repressed, Bruton finally ended up printing the story with a rather small publishing house, and not that many people ever heard about it. So very few people ever learned the truth that George H.W. Bush was at the heart of this scandal that led to a massive economic collapse and a recession, and also a huge taxpayer-funded bailout. And please, never forget, this whole scandal was conceived and orchestrated in order to help a bunch of murderous terrorists in a completely illegal and immoral war. And yes, there is still more. The Iran-Iraq War is another outrageous scandal that is intricately tied in with Iran-Contra and, of course, deeply incriminates both Reagan and our friend H.W. You might remember that Iran's new revolutionary government pretty explicitly hated the United States, which might make you wonder why they were so eager to work with the US to secure those weapons. But the answer's straightforward. They had to, because Saddam Hussein had invaded Iran at the end of 1980. The only reason that Iran was able to fend off Saddam's invading forces was because the Reagan administration started providing Iran with billions of dollars worth of weapons basically from the moment that he took office at the beginning of 1981. But then, fast forward to 1982, and word on the ground was that Iraq was actually on the verge of collapse due to the fierce and unexpected resistance of the Iran military. Now, this resistance was so unexpected because of the US arms embargo as well as, Operation Staunch. Iran shouldn't have been able to get the weapons they needed to fight back. So at this point, Reagan and Bush got the bright idea that they should start helping Iraq, providing Iraq weapons because they didn't want Iran to win this war. If Iran, with their explicitly anti-American regime in power, won this war against Iraq, then that might mean even less access to oil in the region for the US. Even though both countries were considered to be state supporters of terrorism, the Reagan administration thought that Saddam Hussein and Iraq were far more likely to support US interests than the new regime in Iran. The US began assisting Iraq in its war with Iran to ensure that Iran did not win the war, which Iran was only winning because of US covert assistance to Iran. So, after spending 2 years pouring billions and billions of dollars of weapons into Iran to help them fight Iraq, the US decided that they should start dumping billions of dollars in weapons into Iraq to help them fight Iran. US support for Iraq came in the form of economic assistance, military training, intel, and of course, lots and lots of weapons. But just to be crystal clear on this, the Reagan administration did not stop funneling billions of dollars of weapons to Iran just because it started assisting with the Iraqi war effort. Seems to me like Reagan and Bush wanted these two countries wrapped up in a bloody and devastating war for as long as possible. The whole goal was to aid them into mutual annihilation. The Iran-Iraq War lasted nearly the full 8 years of the Reagan-Bush administration. It ended in a stalemate in 1988 after 500,000 people had died. 1 to 2 million people were injured. And of course, the Middle East had been massively destabilized. What the were they doing? Who won here? Well, of course, US weapons manufacturers made a killing. It's what they do. But seriously, what was the goal? Did they really think that if they just helped these people murder each other for long enough, they'd be able to swoop in and take the oil? But how is that supposed to work? We provide them with billions and billions and billions of dollars in high-tech military equipment to weaken them? And at the same time, did these douche canoes really think that nobody would ever find out that they were playing both sides? Because, call me crazy, but to my mind, giving billions and billions and billions of dollars in advanced military equipment to two terrorist states in an attempt to play them against each other just seems a little risky. But don't worry, it gets worse. Do you remember that I mentioned the US was also providing Iraq with intel? Yeah, the CIA was over there and they were keeping a watchful pair of eyes on the seventh circle of hell that Reagan and Bush had created in the Middle East, and as a result, they were able to provide Saddam Hussein with quite a bit of intelligence. Now, the problem is that Saddam was using some of that intelligence in order to launch chemical attacks on Iran on a nearly daily basis. Now, going all the way back, the 1925 Geneva Protocol was established in order to prevent chemical and biological warfare from being used in future wars. They didn't want these kind of weapons used because of the number of unnecessary civilian casualties, as well as due to the traumatic, disturbing, and painful type of death that they deliver. Saddam used mustard gas, sarin gas, and other nerve agents throughout his war with Iran, and CIA documents prove that the Reagan administration not only knew about Saddam's use of these illegal weapons, but that by providing Saddam with all of that intelligence, they actually aided in, quote, some of the most gruesome chemical attacks ever launched. Those chemical weapons attacks killed a minimum of 50,000 people, with at least another 100,000 suffering medical consequences from the attacks. And for reasons we're about to get into, most likely there are Iranians alive today who are still suffering medical consequences from those attacks. In 1988, Saddam ended up gassing his own citizens in the Kurdish village of Halabja. In this widely reported incident, it is said that Saddam used various nerve agents in combination with poison gases in order to murder at least 5,000 Kurdish Iraqis. The Kurds were suffocated, their skin blistered and burned, their bodies convulsed, and their digestive systems also shut down, causing severe vomiting and diarrhea. And for those who were lucky enough to survive, they would continue to suffer from permanent blindness, disfigurement, respiratory, digestive, and neurological disorders. Name any cancer, increased miscarriages, infertility, and also birth defects should the next generation somehow manage to survive. These horrific consequences, combined with the indiscriminate nature of chemical weapons, are why these weapons were banned all the way back in 1925. But to Saddam, that didn't matter because he used them on the precise non-combatants that the Geneva Protocol most wanted to protect. And despite that, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush continued to stand by their man. In fact, the Reagan administration tried, with no evidence, to blame Iran for the attack, even though they had been tacitly approving Saddam Hussein's habitual use of these illegal weapons for years. But don't worry, because George H.W. Bush, he found a way to use the carnage at Halabja to his own despicable ends later on. We'll get there in part 4. Clearly, there are many more very important and totally awful things that Reagan and Bush were able to accomplish together while they shared the White House. But Iran-Contra and the surrounding scandals, well, it does cover a lot of ground. So I am ready to move on to the Bush presidency. But first, let's summarize Iran-Contra. The Reagan administration broke their own arms embargo alongside several other U.S. laws to secretly sell weapons to Iran, a country that they themselves considered to be a terrorist state. They then went on to use the money that they made from those super secret illegal weapon sales in Iran to fund a super secret illegal war in Nicaragua. The Contras, for whose sake Iran-Contra ostensibly occurred, well, they went on to brutally torture and murder thousands of innocent civilians using the aid and the weapons provided by Reagan and Bush. Reagan and Bush shattered U.S. citizens' First Amendment rights by creating a real-life Ministry of Truth that they used to smother dissenting opinions through bullying and smear campaigns, all for the sake of promoting the murderous Contra terrorists. Reagan and Bush allowed Contra conspirators to smuggle tons of drugs into the United States, which caused the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s, and that tore apart poor and working class families across the country. But it was especially terrible and harmful to Black communities. Reagan and Bush then used the crack cocaine epidemic, which they had caused, as an excuse to imprison hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens. And they made sure that the vast majority of those imprisoned were Black, in what was most likely the most racist government decision since Jim Crow. Bush also used a banking scam that was made possible by Reagan-era deregulation to fund his Contra army. And between him and other criminals, well, they defrauded hundreds of financial institutions, which led to a banking crisis, a housing crisis, and finally, a recession. The S&L scandal cost the U.S. taxpayer well over $1 trillion in today's money. And it also resulted in a massive wealth transfer from America's poor and working class to US elites. And all during this time, Bush and Reagan were playing both sides of a war between Iraq and Iran that resulted in hundreds of thousands of more unnecessary deaths. And throughout that same war, Reagan and Bush were also constantly propping up and befriending a vicious dictator in Saddam Hussein, who they knew was constantly breaking international laws that were made to protect humanity from war atrocities. And that is the true story of the Iran-Contra Affair. Most of it anyway, I think. Next time, I will be going into part 4. President George H.W. Bush goes to war. And yes, it gets worse. See you then. Bye.